Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me tonight. This is your host, Brother T. Glad to be with you. We are just kind of running a couple of minutes late tonight, but we're getting there. And we're going to be talking about A Course in Miracles. We're going to be talking about Chapter 2, kind of where we left off last week. And this is very, very relevant to what's going on with us around the world this day and age. It's quite remarkable, really, that all the things that we're encountering in the world. And I've been working on my little studio here, so I've got a little bit of a background. Maybe I'll have that figured out in the not too distant future. But anyway, I just want to say hello and thanks for being with me tonight. I appreciate you being here. So, before we get started, I think we can kind of catch ourselves here. I want to be sure I'm at the right spot where we left off last week. So we had left off with the paragraph 95 on page 35 on the chapter 2, and we're studying this version of A Course in Miracles. But before we begin, let's just join together and take a good deep breath and join together here in a moment of silence. Again, thank you for joining me on the internet. I hope you're doing well. Seems to be a lot going on in the world. This is April 2nd of the year 2020. We're in the middle of the episode of a economic downturn, a pandemic that seems to have gripped our globe, our world, our continents, and our people. And around the globe, literally. Dozens and dozens of countries have shut down their normal way of being, and I'm sure you're familiar with it if you're tuning in and listening in at all to the news. And it's kind of hard not to, right? Granted, we do want to know what's going on around us, and we've been asked to kind of stay shuttered in a little bit at home and not be out too much and to be in public contact. So I hope you're doing well and faring well and through all this. And if you're fortunate enough to be partnered with somebody with you that you can spend time with and not be completely isolated or alone, I think that's wonderful. And if you are isolated and alone, I hope that you're finding the technology and the phone and whatever you need to be in communion and in contact with people. Because God created us in a relationship, and we're not really meant to be isolated and alone. It's very difficult for us as humans to deal with that. So I hope you're finding some peace in your life and in your world. And it is what it is, and at the end of this relatively short journey, we will see a transformation that I personally think is being brought about because we've been asking for the world to change. We've been wanting, those of us as light workers, which includes you, if you're studying A Course in Miracles, of course, you're beginning to take a look at and consider another way of being in the world, maybe another way of seeing your relationship with God, if you will, a deeper and more profound understanding of yourself, who you are and what you are, and certainly a better comprehension of what real love is and how the world's not really understanding it has caused and led to where we are today. And we will persist and move forward because we are in a time of tremendous conscious transformation. And being at home and being in nature, as many people are now, taking walks and being out in nature and being with loved ones, feeling safe in their homes and being out of work and spending time together gives everything kind of a new perspective. So it's a very interesting time, right, that we're working with right now. So I hope you're well. And again, thank you for listening in and joining with me whenever and wherever you may be as you're listening to my voice in this stream of consciousness and the discussion of A Course in Miracles. So let's jump in. We're going to start on paragraph 96. And the subheading of this section is the correction for lack of love. This is page 35 on paragraph 96. When man miscreates, he is in pain. The cause and effect principle here is temporarily a real expediter. Actually, a cause, quote unquote, cause is a term properly belonging to God, and effect, which should also be capitalized, is his Son, capital H, capital S, his Son. This entails a set of cause and effect relationships, which are totally different from those which man introduced into his own miscreations. The fundamental opponents in the real conflict, the basic conflicts, are creation and miscreation. Those are just the fundamental opposing basic conflicts that we're struggling with day in and day out here in the world of form. And this is italicized, and he says, all fear is implicit in the second, just as all love is inherent in the first. Because of this difference, the basic conflict is one between love and fear. When man miscreates, he is in pain. Miscreation is what we are making of ourselves, of our life, of this world of form, and our investment in our ability to believe that we're actually in control, that we're actually doing something that is important. We're staying pretty busy, even in this period of time. I talk to a lot of people that find themselves very busy trying to adjust to this new way of being. So it's very interesting. Paragraph 97. It's always been said that man believes he cannot control fear because he himself created it. His belief in it seems to render it out of his control by definition. Yet any attempt to resolve the basic conflict through the concept of mastery of fear is meaningless. In fact, it asserts the power of fear by the simple assumption that it need be mastered. The essential resolution rests entirely in the mastery of love. In the interim, the period between struggling with fear and the mastery of love, if you will, in the interim, the sense of conflict is inevitable since man has placed himself in a strangely illogical position. He believes in the power of what does not exist. Two concepts which cannot coexist are nothing and everything. To whatever extent one is believed in, the other has been denied. In the conflict, fear is really nothing, and love is everything. This is because whenever light enters darkness, the darkness is abolished. What man believes is true for him. In this sense, the separation has occurred, and to deny this is merely to misuse denial. However, to concentrate on error is merely a further misuse of defenses. The true corrective procedure is to recognize error temporarily, but only as an indication that immediate correction is mandatory. This establishes a state of mind in which the atonement can be accepted without delay. We're saying a lot here. We're really pointing to a lot of our conversation from last week, of course. But we're really talking about, and he's talked about before, as we've read so far, in the proper use of denial. And here he's given us an example that what man believes is true for him. In this sense, the separation has occurred, and to deny this is merely to misuse denial. So to concentrate on error, as an example, to focus on what we might believe as sin or blasphemy. Our lesson for today was was a discussion about I am the light, I am the joy, I am the peace. The light and the joy and the peace of the world is in me, of God is in me. And it was also bringing into the conversation that God guarantees my sinlessness. So that one is pretty difficult to accept, but we're continuing on in our chapter, and also we're almost 100 lessons in. We're at 93 today in the workbook lessons. If you want to check it out, and we have not been able to do every workbook lesson every day, but we are staying consistent. I should say I'm staying consistent on whatever day today is. Like today is day 93 of this year. That's the lesson that I'm working on and sharing with you. And you can find me on facebook.com/Course Mastery. And it should be in the text section or the comment section for this YouTube broadcast. But anyway, the proper use of denial is to basically deny the thoughts of fear, to turn away from the thinking self, if you will. And this confusion of even beginning to concentrate on error is merely a further misuse of defenses. And so he's given us a corrective procedure, and he's saying it is to recognize error temporarily. In other words, we could say, okay, I've made an error in judgment or misperception or miscreation, and I can take responsibility for that. But we're just using that as an indication that a correction is available and necessary, that we need to correct it immediately. And this establishes a state of mind in which the atonement can be accepted without delay. Paragraph 99. It should be emphasized, however, that ultimately there is no compromise possible between everything and nothing. Time is essentially a device by which all compromise in this respect can be given up. It seems to be abolished by degrees because time itself involves a concept of intervals which do not really exist. So he's telling us that time doesn't really exist. How are you with that? Are you okay with that? It's a device. It's a learning device, actually. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. But he's clearly saying that it doesn't really exist. There is only the ever-present now, we could say. But we'll let him share more information with us and help us to understand this a little better. Time is essentially a device by which all compromise in this respect can be given up. It seems to be abolished by degrees because time itself involves a concept of intervals which do not really exist. The faulty use of creation made this necessary as a corrective device. And God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have eternal life, quote unquote. Needs only one slight correction. This is a phrase, obviously, from the Bible. And he's saying that this needs a slight correction. To be entirely meaningful in this context, it should read, he gave it to his only begotten Son. So let's read it again. And so God so loved the world that he gave it to his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. God gave the world to us. God gave the world to you. It should especially be noted that God has only one Son. This seems to be a difficult concept for us to grasp, because this would make, if we said that Jesus was God's only Son, as many believe and have been indoctrinated into that concept, that would make Jesus quite special. You would agree, right? That would make Jesus special. That I would also say that you're not special, right? That Jesus was perfect and you're not. Jesus was the perfect God in form, and you're not. You know, in other words, there's a specialness, which the ego always relies on, this construct of specialness, and that we would hold someone else out separate from ourselves, which is the foundation of the ego's thinking, and that Jesus and many others that we might idolize, if you will, based on what they can or cannot achieve or have not achieved in the world, that their specialness precludes me from being who and what they are. And that was not the message of Jesus. Jesus said, the least, something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing, that even the least among you will do more than I. We are all this perfect creation of God. And the waking up to that, the realizing ourself as who and what we are, is what this journey is all about. And it is what Jesus pointed to as what our journey is all about. So it should be especially noted that God has only one Son. If all the souls God created are His sons, He's expanding here now, then every soul must be an integral part of the whole sonship. That would be you. That would be me. You do not find the concept that the whole is greater than its parts difficult to understand. You should therefore not have too much trouble in understanding this, that we are all an integral part of God, of the whole, and we are all God's children, period. Nothing can ever change it. Again, referring back to our lesson for today, you are as God created you to be, and you can't change it. You're perfect and eternal. And your spirit, you are an idea of love, if you will, in the mind of God that can never be erased or reduced in any way, shape, or form. Paragraph 101, the sonship in its oneness does transcend the sum of its parts. However, this is obscured as long as any of its parts are missing. Think about that now. The sonship in its oneness does transcend the sum of its parts. However, this is obscured as long as any one of its parts are missing. Could we say that we are a part of God, but that we're kind of missing in action, so to speak, that we are, like I remember when my children were asleep when they were young, they would be taking an afternoon nap or whatever, and I'd be wanting to wake them up because they were really missing. They were not consciously with me when they were sleeping. Do you think maybe that's pointing to something? That maybe we are not consciously with God when we are invested in the sleeping self, the sleeping mind, and as he tells us in this book, we are always in a state of dreaming, kind of always in a state of sleep. He's already mentioned that, the Bible said that Adam and Eve, fell asleep, but nowhere does it say that they woke up. The sonship in its oneness does transcend the sum of its parts. However, this is obscured as long as any part is missing. That is why the conflict cannot ultimately be resolved until all the parts of the sonship have returned. That would mean that all of the parts, you and I, all of us as humans, thinking ourselves to be humans, acting human, that that is the atonement, that all of us become conscious and aware and awake as Christ, in perfect safety, in form and field, that we become who we truly are. We become connected with, joined in union and relationship with who we really are, and we begin to express that self. As Jesus said, when you see me, you see the Father. Only then can the meaning of wholeness in the true sense be fully understood, when we are all awake, all self-realized. Any part of the sonship can believe in error or incompleteness, if he so elects. However, if he does so, he is believing in the existence of nothingness. Sounds like a dream. The correction of this error is the atonement. We've already briefly spoken about readiness, but there are some additional points which might be helpful here. Readiness is nothing more than the prerequisite for accomplishment. The two should not be confused. As soon as a state of readiness occurs, there is usually some will to accomplish, but this is by no means necessarily undivided. The state does not imply more than a potential for a shift of will. Confidence cannot develop fully until mastery has been accomplished. We've already attempted to correct the fundamental error that fear can be mastered, and we have emphasized that only love can be mastered. So fear cannot be mastered because, as he's already said, it's not even really real. But love can be mastered, or we could say that love can be known. It can become realized. This book has been identified early on in the introduction, in the preface, as removing the obstacles to the awareness of presence of love. Therein lies the peace of God. So the state does not imply more than a potential for a shift of will. I jumped ahead, so let me back up. We've already briefly spoken about readiness, but there are some additional points which might be helpful. Readiness is nothing more than the prerequisite for accomplishment. The two should not be confused. As soon as a state of readiness occurs, there's usually some will to accomplish, but this is by no means necessarily undivided. The state does not imply more than a potential for a shift of will. The state of readiness, right, does not imply more than a potential for a shift of will. To me, that's kind of pointing out that we are not alone, that we don't have to do this alone, that it's really not up to us to do this thing called self-realization. It's up to us to be willing, to be ready, and to allow it to be our experience. Paragraph 103. Confidence cannot develop fully until mastery has been accomplished. We've already attempted to correct the fundamental error that fear can be mastered, and have emphasized that only love can be mastered. You've attested only to your readiness. Mastery of love involves a much more complete confidence than either of you has attained. He was speaking here, obviously, he says either of you. He was talking to Helen Schachman and William Thedford, who was partnering with her in this, as he was communicating A Course in Miracles. All right, I had us muted there for a second. Sorry about that. Just 1 second. I just wanted to kind of get the background noise taken out there. You've attested only to your readiness. Mastery of love involves a much more complete confidence than either of you has attained. However, the readiness at least is an indication that you believe this is possible. That is only the beginning of confidence. In case this be misunderstood to imply that an enormous amount of time will be necessary between readiness and mastery, let me remind you that time and space are under my control. So it's said then that Jesus has shared with us in the teaching that one miracle will shift time dramatically. And this is a course in miracles. And what have we discussed about a miracle? A miracle is a sudden shift of perception. So the time that we might have been, quote unquote, scheduled, or the potential that we might say we would have had to traverse, let's say, several lifetimes to come to a higher level of consciousness, to begin to awaken. One miracle, a single miracle, it's been said, can avoid thousands of years, 1,000 years. Well, let's just say 100 years or one lifetime. I mean, just think about that, you know. So is this work important? Absolutely. And people are awakening now in this new energy that we are experiencing. I'm not just talking about these recent events at all. I'm talking about our whole planet. Since this work came into existence in the early 70s and was published for public consumption, and also the harmonic conversion in 1987, and there's been a huge shift of energy in our planet. It's been a huge shift of consciousness in our planet. We have, I will say, already avoided some very serious catastrophes or calamities because miracles are already happening, and we have skipped forward over those things that were considered at one time to be a necessary part of our evolution. And we've already avoided those things by being invested and following a new way of understanding and knowing ourselves in God and in love and the teachings of our brother Jesus. So it's happening. It's absolutely happening, and this is a very joyful time. And as I said earlier when we began discussions tonight, that it's really a lot to do with, it's got a lot to do what's going on now with this transformation. I mean, it's happening. So while it may look dire in some places for some, at the bottom line, at the end of the day, it's who we are, who you are, and the consciousness that you're holding that will set the tone for the experiences that you have through whatever the world is going through right now, day to day, every day. We are creators. We are the energy of the Creator in action, and our consciousness is being reflected back to us. And it's happening even in this event, though we may not, the ego mind, what I sometimes refer to as the cat mind. And if you travel back at all in any of the episodes here in A Course in Miracles and some of those before in Spiritual Mastery, I've talked about that at some length. But the ego mind is completely incapable of understanding and knowing anything. It's incapable of learning, actually. I know that doesn't sound correct, but that actually is correct. But there is a part of us, the Christ self, that is capable of learning, and we're waking up, and it's happening now. So mastery of love involves a much more complete confidence than either of you has attained. However, the readiness, at least, is an indication that you believe it's possible, that you believe this is possible. And keep in mind, this is very early this is the textbook, and this is very early, and this started in 1965 when Helen Schachtman began to hear the voice of Jesus coming through, and she began to scribe this teaching. That's the arrangement that she had made before coming into this incarnation, incarnation, and so he is speaking to her, and William Thetford, who was her partner, and we're only 30 pages into the scribing, right? And this is a pretty thick book, right? It's a pretty thick book, so 30 pages in. So this is him speaking to her, but also speaking to us. So you might understand, how it was deemed necessary or important to take some of these statements and some of the language out of these first few chapters. But I find it, for me, more acceptable that it remained in the Your Text version, and that's why I particularly enjoy the Your Text version. I want to read and know and experience what Helen was experiencing as she was scribing this work. So this is only the beginning of confidence, in case this be misunderstood to imply that an enormous amount of time will be necessary between readiness and mastery. Let me remind you that time and space are under my control. So this is Jesus having a very intimate conversation with Helen and William Thetford, Helen Shockman and William Thetford. So he's going on in paragraph 104. One of the chief ways in which man can correct his magic miracle confusion is to remember that he did not create himself. He is apt to forget this when he becomes egocentric, and this places him in a position where the belief in magic in some form is virtually inevitable. His will to create was given him by his own Creator, who was expressing the same will in his creation, in our creation. God was expressing that same will to be a creator. Since creative ability rests in the mind, everything that man creates is necessarily a matter of will. It also follows that whatever he creates is real in his own sight, but not necessarily in the sight of God. This basic distinction leads us directly into the real meaning of the Last Judgment. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Last Judgment here, and you might think, oh, this is going to get really heavy. So what is the Last Judgment? Let me just speak for myself. As I was growing up and had some early indoctrination into Christian theology, it was when I would die, I would go to have a judgment day, and I would go before God or before God's emissaries, whoever they might, St. Peter, whatever. Obviously, I didn't stay and go to church a lot, and I've never really studied the Bible, not to any great degree. But that our sins, the errors that we would make, we would be held accountable for that. And at least in the theology that I had been introduced to by my parents, that I could be condemned to eternal damnation. We would call that hell. And then there were images of devils and fire and, this eternal horrific suffering. And that was the God that we were supposed to, number one, be very afraid of, out of respect, of course, and also could be jealous and wrathful and vengeful, and that's why I didn't go to church much. I couldn't imagine it being realistic. I don't think it takes much reason to be willing to look at what we've been told, that God was made in our image, because we can certainly see men and have known men, and they exist today, that would manipulate all of us if they could, rule the world if they could. People have been starved, people have been tortured, people have been put through hell. But that was done by man, that was not done by God. So this whole idea of the Last Judgment, is frightening. It certainly was for me, and that, there's no option, there's no choice, and no matter how good you get or how good you are, you can't escape hell if you don't live a certain way and live by certain rules. And so God has all these rules, and love can only be expressed in certain ways that are approved of by God. Regardless of how your heart feels, you can't, love somebody else if it's not proper according to some rules or some bias. So let's jump in. This is section 6, and the title of this section is The Meaning of the Last Judgment. The Last Judgment is one of the greatest threat concepts in man's perception. Yes, no doubt. No doubt. This is only because he does not understand it. Judgment is not an essential attribute of God. It's an essential attribute of man, however, right? Or the ego. I'm adding that. Continuing, man brought judgment into being only because of the separation. After the separation, however, there was a place for judgment as one of the many learning devices in which had to be built into the overall plan. There was a place for judgment as one of the many learning devices which had to be built into the overall plan. Just as the separation occurred over many millions of years, the Big Bang, what we would say is the Big Bang theory, right? The formation of our planet, what I think little we do know, and we think we know a lot about it through our scientists and our astrologers and all of it. And certainly it's amazing what we've come to grasp about our universe and our universe of universes. But still, we really know almost nothing, right? But that he's saying here that after the separation, which is when the mind split, the tiny mad idea that we could be separate, the metaphor of Adam and Eve, there was a place for judgment as one of the many learning devices which had to be built into the overall plan. The overall plan for us to wake up and return to our sanity, to return to our right mind. It was all built into the plan, right? And just as the separation occurred over many millions of years, the last judgment will extend over a similarly long period and perhaps an even longer one. Its length depends, however, on the effectiveness of the present speed up. And A Course in Miracles is a speed up. And that present, and this was 1965, right? And it took 7 years for Helen to scribe all of this because there was a textbook and then the workbook and then the manual for teachers. But over 7 years. So I don't know how long it took her to scribe just the first text part of it, the first book, which was the text. But he was already talking then about a speed up, the present speed up. And what's that speed up? That speed up is in our awakening to the realization, self-realization of who and what we are. Paragraph 106, you have frequently, on page 37 again, we have frequently noted that the miracle, which is a sudden shift of perception, I'm putting that in there, continuing, is a device for shortening but not abolishing time. If a sufficient number of people become truly miracle-minded quickly, the shortening process can be almost immeasurable. So it's not going to take millions of years for you to wake up. Hallelujah, right? You're not going to be human-bound, earth-bound, and exist in form for millions of years and suffering and struggling before you could finally become self-realized. He's saying that if a sufficient number of people, and that's the whole purpose of the Course in Miracles, really, the curriculum as we know it now and all the teachings that are coming to us through Spirit and all these different mediums that's coming now, they're all teaching the same thing. I could say, well, they're all teaching the Course in Miracles. And we can look back even to others who were certainly connected and listening to Spirit and guided by Spirit 100 years ago. We're making quantum leaps of understanding of our relationship with God as compared to what had happened in the hundreds of years before that. But I love that part about the speed up. So we've frequently noted that a miracle is a device for shortening but not abolishing time. But if a sufficient number of people become truly miracle-minded quickly, the shortening process can be almost immeasurable. It is essential, however, that these individuals free themselves from fear sooner than would ordinarily be the case, because they must emerge from the conflict if they are to bring peace to other minds. So I want to back up just a little bit And we're going to talk about the concepts. The two concepts which cannot coexist are nothing and everything. To whatever extent one is believed in, the other has been denied. In the conflict, fear is really nothing and love is everything. So that is the conflict that we've been talking about tonight, right? That there is these two things cannot really coexist. Nothing and everything. Love is everything and fear is nothing. So back to paragraph 106. That it is essential, however, that these individuals are free themselves from fear sooner than would ordinarily be the case, because they must emerge from the conflict if they're to bring peace to other minds. So that would be you, that would be me, that would be why we're discussing A Course in Miracles to begin with, because we can bring about an end to the conflict of our own within our own mind by joining in union and relationship with Spirit. It's referred to as the holy instant, and we'll be discussing it. So the last judgment, paragraph 107, the last judgment is generally thought of as a procedure undertaken by God. Actually, it'll be undertaken by man with my help. So Jesus is going to help us to undertake the process of the last judgment. It's a final healing rather than a meting out of punishment. However, much man may think that punishment is deserved. However much, let me read that again. However much man may think that punishment is deserved, the final judgment is there is no punishment. It's all not true. This whole idea of a God that's vengeful and wrathful and jealous and something to be feared is ridiculous. And Jesus, who we've completely misinterpreted his message for thousands of years now, is setting the record straight and saying, no way, that's not God. There is no judgment of God. It's man, and with Jesus' help, we can begin to truly see the truth about who and what we are. No matter how much we think we might deserve it. Punishment is a concept in total opposition to right-mindedness. The aim of the last judgment is to restore right-mindedness to man. Spoiler alert. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let the genie out of the bottle. Hard to get her back in there, isn't it? You're perfect. Neither behind the point of perfection nor advancing toward it. That's the last judgment. The last judgment that you would lay upon yourself. And with the help of your brother Jesus, when you're joined in union and relationship with Jesus in mind, be able to actually understand and know yourself through the eyes of Christ as who and what you are as equals, as an equal in the eyes of God with Jesus and any and all enlightened saints and masters that we might look to or idolize that have already escaped this energetic level, this dense level of what we might call this planet Earth. Punishment is a concept in total, and this is italicized, total opposition to right-mindedness. The aim of the last judgment is to restore right-mindedness to man. Paragraph 108, the last judgment might be called a process of right evaluation. It simply means that finally all men will come to understand what is worthy and what is not. After this, their ability to choose can be directed reasonably. Until this distinction is made, however, the vacillations between free and imprisoned will Let me read again. Until this distinction is made, however, the vacillations between free and imprisoned will cannot but continue. And when you read the word but in here, sometimes and you're like, what is he saying? I mean, it's written in Shakespearean iambic pentameter. We don't always speak that way, right? You can replace the word but with the word only. So we could say here, until this distinction is made, right? However, the vacillations between free and imprisoned will can only continue. The first step toward freedom must entail a sorting out of the false from the true. This is a process of division only in the constructive sense and reflects the true meaning of the apocalypse. Scary word. And it's actually italicized in this book. Man will ultimately look upon his own creations and will to preserve only what is good, just as God himself looked upon what he had created and knew that it was good. Paragraph 109. At this point, the will can begin to look with love on its own creations because of their great worthiness. The mind will inevitably disown its miscreations, which, without the mind's belief, will no longer exist. The term last judgment is frightening, not only because it has been falsely projected onto God, but also because of the association of last with death. This is an outstanding example of an upside-down perception. Actually, if the meaning of the last judgment is objectively examined, it's quite apparent that it is really the doorway to life. No one who lives in fear is really alive. His own last judgment cannot be directed toward himself because he is not his own creation. He can, however, apply it meaningfully, and at any time, to everything he has created, and retain in his memory only what is good. This is what his right-mindedness cannot but dictate. The purpose of time is solely to give him time to achieve this judgment. It is his own judgment, his own perfect judgment of his own creations. When everything he retains is lovable, there is no reason for fear to remain with him. This is his part in the atonement. This is his part in the atonement. And that is the end of chapter 2. So let's pause for a moment and take a good deep breath. You know, I've heard it said that this book has a lot of dark ink, as it's related to said dark ink. Yeah. The ego is not always something pretty to look at. And we will look at the ego to quite a degree because we really need to see and understand the ego. Because it's like, as my wife says, cunning and baffling is a phrase that she uses. And in the Course in Miracles, he says that the ego operates between suspicious and vicious, from suspicious to vicious, the spectrum that the ego operates in. We already know that its foundation is only fear and guilt. It's always putting guilt into the mix, to the murky soup of the ego mind. And yeah, there is, quite a bit of examination of the ego in this book, and we're going to get into it, right? Chapter 3 is retraining the mind, and that's where we'll start next week. But the reason I'm pointing it out is because there's a contrast here that is very freeing, amazingly freeing. There's a contrast to that review of the ego self, to look at it and understand it. It's not to condemn it or hate it, but I remember when I was first starting A Course in Miracles, there were times when I would see the ego as an enemy, and I saw it as very dark and not something pretty or that it was something to be, to dislike, to be afraid of, even, giving it power that it never had. But when I was first reading this work and really looking at my egoic self to that degree for the first time, I certainly didn't like what I saw. And I knew that it was true. I mean, because it was it's almost like my mind was being read, right, by this teacher. Well, of course my mind is being read. There is no such thing as private thoughts. We're going to run into that. We're going to talk about that. We're going to examine that. You're not alone. You think you're human. You think your mind is in your brain and your thinking is conducted by your brain and your consciousness is in your brain and you're a body. And no. When you get to the point where you can move beyond that, those limitations, that ridiculous idea that God would create something so limited anyway, as I said earlier tonight, it doesn't take very much reason and logic to begin to dispel all of these false concepts that we've lived by and been indoctrinated to, and by well-intentioned people, no doubt, at least certainly many and most of them, for hundreds of years and generation after generation after generation. And none of it's true, and it's not necessary. But the good news is also here, right? And that's what I'm always, when I go back and read this book again, that's what jumps off the page at me now, is I feel such a sense of freedom that there's so much good news, that none of this stuff that that the world is so vested in, these false idols, these golden calves, right? They're not important. They're not even real. Like the dream we have, that I'll have later tonight, and you will too, very possibly, that it's just illusion. Then you wake up and realize it was just a dream. No one who lives in fear is really alive. It's time to begin to live. It's time to live anew. His own judgment, this would be God's children, his child's own last judgment, cannot be directed toward himself because he is not his own creation. So we begin to look out upon our creations and we begin to really truly value them. Now we would be joined in union and in relationship with our higher self. We could say with the Holy Spirit. We could also say with Jesus Christ. We could say with a host of our guides and comforters and family and friends that are cheering us on as we take those last few steps of self-awareness. All of that's good news. And we can apply that then, and we begin to see our creations and miscreations, but we begin to see creations which are things that are new, that are eternal, that are extensions, I should say new, but that are expressions and extensions of what God is, who we are, the God within me, right? The God within me. I want to go back to today's lesson. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but just real quick, just to be sure that I'm phrasing it properly for you. Light and joy and peace abide in me. Light and joy and peace. You think you are the home of evil, darkness, and sin. You think if anyone could see the truth about you, he would be repelled, recoiled from you as if from a poisonous stake. You think if what is true about you were revealed to you, you would be struck with horror so intense that you would rush to death by your own hand, living on after seeing this being impossible. These are beliefs so firmly fixed that it's difficult to help you see that they are based on nothing. You've been deceiving and afraid of foolish fantasies and savage dreams that have bowed down to idols made of dust. All this is true by what you now believe. Why would you not be overjoyed to be assured that all the evil that you think you did was never done, that all your sins are nothing, that you are as pure and holy as you were created, and that light and joy and peace abide in you? My sinlessness is guaranteed by God. All right, we'll leave it that. We'll leave it with that. And let's take a good deep breath and we'll close with a prayer. I am in need of nothing but the truth. If I'm willing to allow only that which expresses Christ consciousness, if I embrace my willingness to be ready for miracles to begin to happen, to begin to be observable. They're already happening all around me, but to be the witness to miracles, to be able to see and notice those miracles, to begin to see my own perfect creations that happen, that actually have happened and are happening, to remove the obstacles to the awareness and presence of love. That is our purpose in this practice. I am in need of nothing but the truth. I sought for many things and found despair. Now do I seek but one. For in that one is all I need, and only what I need. All that I sought before I needed not and did not even want. My only need I did not recognize, but now I see that I need only truth. In that all needs are satisfied, all cravings end, all hopes are finally fulfilled, and dreams are gone. Now have I everything that I could need. Now have I everything that I could want. And now at last I find myself at peace. And for that peace, our Father, we give thanks. What we denied ourselves, you have restored. And only that is what we really want. And so it is. Amen. And God bless. Stay the course, my brothers and sisters. I love you. Thanks for hanging out with me again tonight. And I look forward to being with you throughout the week on facebook.com/Course Mastery, the Best Hour radio broadcast, which is a podcast of the workbook lessons. I'm making an effort to really be consistent going forward this week as we will cross the threshold. A week from today, we'll be on lesson 100. And it's happening. The consciousness of our planet is growing rapidly. And you are not alone. Even if you have been isolated for some time, you cannot be alone. You'll never be alone. You're perfect, neither behind the point of perfection nor advancing toward it. I love you. God bless. And we'll see you next week. Goodbye.